In the next bunch of sections, we're going to be covering a bunch of different types of disorders and different categories of disorders. And there are so many that we could be talking about, but I'm going to pick and choose just a few that I think do the best job summarizing the diversity of psychological disorders. So we're going to start with looking at some neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are disorders that affect the brain and our neurological systems. And because of the developmental component, we're seeing them first develop in infancy and early childhood. And so a lot of these are going to stick with you as you get older. So the symptoms may change and sort of morph as you get older. So the individuals with these disorders will they may grow out of them, or they may even just learn to adapt and sort of behave in such a way that those disorders don't affect them as much. Some of the symptoms may change or may be more or less intensive, have larger or smaller effect. But yeah, we do see these endure for long periods of time, though they do tend to change over time. And this whole broad category of neurodevelopmental disorders, which we have some examples on the next slide, looking at intellectual disorders, communication disorders, autism spectrum disorder, which we'll actually talk about in just a few slides, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, specific learning disorder, motor disorders, and so on. There's quite a wide variety of these. And as I said in my sort of intro for this video, we're only going to be focusing on a couple of the disorders that we could be talking about for each of these categories. But for our general description of this category of disorders, they are typically shown, or is typically known for impairments and deficits in a whole bunch of different areas of the child's life. So it looks at academic ability, social relationships, their ability to function and regulate emotions, as well as we sometimes see behavioral problems. And so because of all of these different sort of symptoms, children are often slower to reach milestones, so developmental milestones, especially those that are related to speech and language and motor skills and learning. And they might even have issues with retaining information. And a lot of these disorders tend to be comorbid with other disorders. So if a child meets one diagnostic criteria for one of these developmental disorders, they often will meet the criteria for others as well. So comorbidity just means that they tend to have both disorders or multiple disorders at the same time. And as promised, our example of these neurodevelopmental disorders, we're going to look a little bit more in depth into autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And this is actually an interesting case where this is a new addition to the most recent version of the DSM. So with the DSM-5, this was the introduction of the autism spectrum disorder. Previous iterations of this sort of manual had sort of separated everything out into discrete categories. So they had Asperger's syndrome, autism, and pervasive developmental disorder, which have all been folded under this new label. And it's kind of interesting to think that there had previously been these wide used diagnostic labels that are now not used any longer. So that's one of the problems of shifting and adjusting our different disorder criteria. And this is another one of those disorders that's going to have a fairly wide range of impairments and lots of different phenotypes, so lots of different traits and symptoms that we're going to observe. So we can see all sorts of variety. So some children will have, or I guess some individuals with autism will have sort of issues with social, emotional, behavioral, and communication interactions. Some may choose to avoid interacting with people, might be hypersensitive to touch. And it's common to see difficulty understanding social cues. But on that sort of variety of different possible phenotypes, we might see that One child receiving this diagnosis may only have trouble with social interactions, whereas another child under the same diagnosis may be completely non-vocal. They don't use spoken language, or they may engage in self-injurious behavior. So it might be a lot more disruptive or potential for self-harm. And so, for our prevalence of this disorder, we tend to see about 1% of the population, probably North America centric. And that number is rising. And it's kind of unclear if that's because of sort of this change in the diagnostic criteria, the change in sort of employment of that criteria, or something else. So, something to keep in mind for the future.